World Energy Congress. Let's get back from Rotterdam.
It started with the economic and financial crisis, was followed by COVID, was followed by the explosion of the port, and then more recently we have a war at the border, we have a regional war that we are contending with, and yet in every challenge there is an opportunity.
That's a pretty long list of pretty.
It is, yes, and every one of those,
that's pretty challenging.
Every one of those we were able to survive. We were able to get past, in a sense, and still continue resisting, and still continue living, and continue building, hopefully, for a better future. And the opportunity I'm talking about is in Lebanon. We realized that actually having access to subsidized energy is not a source of good in a sense, because what it does is that it empties the pockets of the government. It empties the ability of the government to be able to do more focused and more targeted, and I'm talking about blind subsidies, not even targeted subsidies, to do more targeted developmental efforts, and to also safeguard people's wealth, because what we have seen in Lebanon is people lost their wealth and all their savings because of these negligent policies. Now, thankfully, ever since we started in my role in the ministry, we realized this and we explained it to the people. We explained it to the people that this money that's being paid for subsidized energy is actually getting out of their own pockets in the end. And hence, that this is not a good idea, and we went and very forcefully removed the subsidies. What did that mean? It meant that the price of the energy became reflective of its cost. So people suddenly understood that energy costs a lot of money, and this induced the right behavior. So first big positive result, is a reduction of the energy volume or the energy demand in Lebanon by 40%. So for example, in the 35%, I want to say, the electricity demand was reduced by 35%. Another very positive outcome is the automatic incentive to invest in alternatives that are, by the same token, good for economically, because they are much lower cost, and at the same time a lot more sustainable environmentally speaking and from a health perspective. And this, of course, I'm talking about investment in distributed renewable energy. So people in their houses, people in their corporate environment, people in their industries started investing in solar energy, because the real cost of solar energy in Lebanon is a fraction of the cost of imported energy, which is the imported conventional power that we have until now have had to rely on for over a century, I want to say, or more. And that resulted in a disproportionate growth of renewable energy, which is now amounting to 25% of the Lebanese energy portfolio. 25%, 5% of which is in hydropower, and 20% of which is in solar energy, distributed solar energy. And mind you, this is all without debt funding. It's all individual and communal equity funding, and we still have 25%. So I am very optimistic about the future of renewable energy in Lebanon. I'm optimistic about the future of hydrogen in Lebanon, especially in the industrial sector. And I think we're going to see some of the first projects in Lebanon in this area, simply because of economics and incentives.
Okay, that's perfect. You park it there, and I'll circle back in terms of raising money.
Yes.
You talked about in our green room conversation about debt finance and the roles that could trigger. Your Excellency, Sharif Al-Ulama, Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber, who's a COP28 president, received the first award for the energy transition from the World Energy Council. It was terrific on Sunday evening, and he talked about the UAE consensus, which is something I know because I was at COP28 and involved, as you know, in the build-up. What are the key concrete takeaways? Because you said this is something you wanted to stress. A lot of people hear the consensus, but in practical terms, and I know you were working to make this a practical COP. And how does it apply to the UAE in terms of actions on the ground in the country? I think that's a good place to start.
Obviously, the UAE consensus, what we were able to achieve in Dubai was unprecedented. It was the first global stocktake that had occurred since the Paris Agreement. Inclusivity was at the core of the consensus itself. There was a drive in terms of expediting and fast-tracking the energy transition in a just and orderly manner. Similarly, it was historic that there was a clear statement related to fossil fuels, i.e. transitioning away from fossil fuels in a just, orderly and equitable manner as well. Obviously, there were a big consensus around 132 countries signed up for tripling up renewables and doubling down on the energy efficiency rates by the year 2030. In addition to that, I think one of the historic achievements was you had around 52 national and international oil companies, which represent around 40% of the global oil production, signing up for the decarbonization charter. And basically, a lot of them, or the majority of them, have committed to going to net zero by the year 2050. In this aspect, of course, ADNOC, led by Dr. Sultan, always like to raise the bar, and they put a year of 2045 as their target of reaching net zero. There was also a agreement in terms of developing and driving methane emissions to zero by the year 2030, and of course, transitioning away from coal. Now, some statistics, John. 3.6 million of the global population actually live in areas that are highly susceptible to climate change. On the other side of the coin, and it's a true and sad reality, is energy poverty is something that we are all living in today's day and age. 1 out of each 6 individuals globally does not have access to electricity. That's around 1.1 billion, or around 13.5% of the global population. And why I mention these two is you have to balance. You have such a big population that are exposed to climate change impacts, and at the same time, you have another big amount of people who don't have access to electricity. I think the true challenge lies in terms of how we deliver against what we promise and what we target. And in reality, and COP28 actually showed that, is there is a huge gap in terms of implementation. Yes, we are all good in terms of putting ambitious and setting up huge targets, but when it comes to implementation, we fall short. And COP28 actually showed that.
This was a much more practical approach, right? So less wrestling about the final communique, if you will, or the final statement, just to say, and it's interesting because there's a troika structure now, right? With Azerbaijan and in Brazil, to say that we have continuity. So do you think that could actually lead to a much more, would you say, accountable process within the COP?
Definitely, definitely. And this is one of the lessons learned that we saw as the UAE from previous COPs, is the disconnect. And that's why this decision, and it is a very, very smart decision that was taken by the 3 COP presidents of the UAE currently, and Azerbaijan next, and then Brazil, is to form this troika to make sure that there is consistency, that there is a follow-up, that there is continuity. One of the things that I really want to focus on as well is we know that we have, and His Excellency Walid mentioned, is there is an issue when it comes to climate finance. This is the big problem. Let's be very frank, and I think during COP28 everybody acknowledged, is that what we committed to during the Paris Agreement in terms of funding, we have fallen short significantly. And we really need to recover. We need to fast track financing green renewable energy. We need to find or restructure the global financial architecture. And we need to find practical solutions for investors to actually invest in renewable energy. I think, if you allow me, John, also I want to take this opportunity, as we are the co-president, to just maybe over 5 minutes, or 3 minutes, as much time as I have, is to explain what we have done in the UAE. If you look at solar energy, in the year 2018, we were at around 1.8 gigawatts of capacity. By the year 2022, we doubled that. And by the year 2023, we increased it by another 70%. So today, we are at 6 gigawatts of solar capacity. And we are well on our track to hit 14.2 gigawatts, triple, by the year 2030. When you look at wind, the UAE is not known for high wind. It's not a high wind area. But we didn't let that limit us. Of course, building on partnerships we have with other governments and technology providers, we capitalized on low wind speed technology. And we piloted wind turbines in the Habshan region. And we are actually currently now producing 100 megawatts of wind power. And this will be expanded further. Nuclear, we all know about the Baraka nuclear plant. The fourth reactor, we are anticipating that it will come on stream this year in commercial operation. That will give us 5.6 gigawatts of clean power, covering 25% of our electricity needs. We are also, it's a known fact, a major member of the OPEC family. But at the same time, we are also proud that we introduced the first commercial CCS facility in the Middle East, a Riyadh plant, that was capturing around 800,000 tons of CO2 in the year 2016. There has been a commitment from ADNOC to fivefold that to 5 million, and very recently they've announced that they're going to go up to 10 million by the year 2030. And then also we are looking at hydrogen. We launched our national hydrogen strategy where we're targeting 1.4 million tons of hydrogen per annum by the year 2031. And if you look at that number, and through the stakeholders we have in the country, we see that the demand in the country for hard-to-abate sectors like aluminum, steel, cement is 2.7 million tons of hydrogen. So even what we're going to produce, the requirements or the need in the country is higher than that. And that poses an opportunity for investors to come and actually invest in the UAE.
Okay. Why don't we leave it there, which is perfect because it's a great overlay, as did Dr. Walid. So this is excellent. And I think as a natural transition, it's terrific to have somebody who's a global research strategist, but that intimately knows the region. And one of the things I was thinking about this morning, Dr. Amrita, is that when we had this conversation 5 years ago, it was like, oh, panic. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, they're so dependent on oil and gas, they're just going to be leveled by the energy transition. So you can hear there's a strategy in place. So from the NOCs, which I think have done a phenomenal job of becoming international players in short order, how do they manage this transition? A, to clean up their supply chains as fast as possible. But then, if you fast forward to 2040, what's their business model look like? Have you given it thought?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And again, thank you to World Energy Council for putting this together, especially, sitting in Rotterdam and talking about the Middle East. And it's brave, and I think it needs to be done, right? So it's really commendable. To your question, I think the biggest issue right now is also acknowledging, to your point, how much these NOCs have transformed, right? When you're thinking about a circular economy, kind of capturing carbon, using that for, and making the whole system a lot more energy efficient, as His Excellency said as well, UAE, I mean, look at the strides UAE is making, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, all of them, in renewables as well. Doesn't get talked about other than from people in the region, right? So I think the starting point of this is there's so much focus on international energy companies, right? What are the majors doing? But I think the level field needs to also be what are the NOCs not just doing, but their plans for 2040. Because the critical thing, what they have shown in their planning is they actually think long term. If you, not just 2040, even through to 2050, some really ambitious targets for energy intensity reduction, but also about reducing the dependency on oil, as you kind of rightly pointed out, oil and gas revenues, but doing it in a manner that continues to supply the world with the energy it requires. Because that for me was the biggest takeaway for COP, is that you can't sit in the West, which is where all the energy transition, I don't want to use the word noise, but you get my point, that energy transition chatter comes from, without saying, okay, by the way, developing countries, we are still going to require energy, who's going to supply that, right? And I think that's the key balance I find the NOCs in the region are doing very, very well, saying, we will continue to supply the energy, but let's decarbonize the hydrocarbon chain. That is the #1 priority, but also let's make our own economy green, right? So that allows us to export more. Like Saudi Arabia still burned a lot of crude oil in their power generation. They're doing a lot more gas into the system as a way to get oil out. And I think this is critical, and I want to highlight in particular one thing, because you asked about the long-term strategy. Financing is so critical right now, right? And we see this time and time again. Western banks do not want to finance anything to do with oil and gas, right? Because it's a bit like, oh, if it's oil and gas, it's dirty, and therefore we're not going to finance it. One of the things that doesn't get talked about is downstream refining. And unfortunately, if we're not building refineries, none of us consume oil. We consume gasoline and diesel and so on. And refining is also one of the most emitting areas we have. Like if you want to reduce Scope 3 emissions, you shut down a refinery, as you see time and time again happening in North America and in Europe. What we see, particularly for NOCs in the Middle East, other than the push towards decarbonizing the chain, is they are the only ones investing in the downstream. And I shouldn't just limit myself to refining, it's downstream as a whole. And we always tend to talk about the upstream because that's where a lot of it's political and kind of gets the media attention. But downstream is a lot more critical for people, right? Only region that's built, like Al Zour, the last big refinery, that was Kuwait. If you look at UAE and the continuous investment in also making refineries greener, a lot of the hydrogen projects, I was told earlier today, is going to be in Ruwais, very close to my heart in terms of the refinery. Saudi Arabia, Aramco has consistently gone and invested in refining in the East, China, India. Even places in India and China will say to me, refineries are like, no bank will sponsor or finance downstream. Even power grids, for instance. That's where Middle Eastern NOCs are so critical. Financing that, because it is a cash-rich region, and saying, okay, we will invest 10%, or we'll take 10% of your company, 20% of your company, to allow that, I mean, that's sustainability for me. Doing it in the right way, clean way. Because suddenly, and we do foresee a shortage in downstream capacity in the medium term by 2030, because other than the Middle East, nobody else is investing. And I think that, to me, is one of the biggest strategies, successful strategies, arguably, for these NOCs kind of going forward, like 10, 20 years, which nobody in the Western world is even looking at.
It's excellent. It's also, I'll circle back with you, if you don't mind, about their international role. So building that refining capacity is one, but they're now, I see this in Abu Dhabi and in Saudi Arabia, they're taking stakes in other fields, which is a profound shift in strategy and unearthing, I think, value within the organization. So ADNOC has done, what, 6, I think, Sri? 6 spin-offs in the last 4 years, which was value that was locked into the NOC, and it's recognized value at the same time. Sarah, it's great to have you. And I always, because I've covered the region for so long, I always think of Kuwait as the kind of the quiet, confident, low-profile player, but it does so consistently with its natural resources. And I know you wanted to talk about what is the role of the NOCs of the region in the energy transition itself. And if you didn't know what was taking place, you'd say this is going to be like a barren town. dependent on oil and gas, but you see it very differently. Articulate why. Amrita covered some of that. Do you want to take it from the prism of Kuwait?
Yes. So thank you, John. I just want to start with a correction. We should rename the Middle East to the place where East and West meet. Because genuinely, if you look at Middle East now, and I disagree with Amrita, we are taking charge. Look at what UAE did during COP. It's not like we shyly driving transition, no. We are at the forefront,
Yes.
and we are taking the charge. Look at the concepts that came from Saudi, net zero, circular economy. So I think we are at the forefront and we will keep pushing through. And why is that? Because in principle, we look at ourselves as the people who secure energy for the world. And that is the role that we will continue to embrace and push. And look, oil and gas is the current business that is securing the energy of the world. And think about it. You know, yes, we think about renewable, but the only reliable fuel that you have today, reliable, because when you have storms, typhoons, no cloud, lots of clouds, you don't have those other sources of energy. The only way you can get to where you want is if you have a reliable source, 100% reliable source, and the only source that you have now to fly your ships, to fly your planes, to drive your ships, comes from oil and gas. So,
If you can get ships to fly, then you're really looking into the future.
spaceships, I'm talking about spaceships.
I know, of course, I knew that.
So,
Rotterdam would buy all those airships all over the place if you can get them to fly. Go ahead.
So this is how the region sees its position. Securing energy for the world, being renewable, being oil and gas. And the focus is, like Amrita said, it's very important. We will provide oil and gas, but we are making sure that we are controlling emissions. We are completely going to zero emission, and we decarbonize, we utilize CO2, remove all the carbon. Now, are we supported by the world in this process? Not really, because we don't really have the technologies to that level where they are economical, scalable, and viable for businesses to do so. So we really need to invest in a lot of technology in order to be at that stage. Yes, we do have some, but we are not there yet. So that is one element. And then, think about it. Today the world, and I mentioned this, consumes 15% of energy for data. But where can you get the cheapest energy to fuel your data? It's actually the Middle East. Yesterday I took a taxi from this place to my hotel, and it cost me 42 euros. You know how much it would cost me in Kuwait? Probably 5 euros. So I think about this massive change in the value of energy, and the only place that can provide low cost, sustainable energy, even for the world, so that you all can use your mobiles and enjoy your internet and Netflix, is the Middle East. And it is not the Middle East, it is the place where all the Chinese companies, all the Korean companies, or even Russian, okay, everybody is actually working in harmony with American, European, and all. So we need to all collaborate to make this secure energy for the whole world, and this is the model.
Great. I have a quick follow-up, and then I'll bring Marco into the conversation. I appreciate his patience. There's a perception that, and I brought it up yesterday in the fireside chat with Amin, Nasser, and Angela, is that the Gulf producers are just out to protect their market share for oil and gas. They're the lowest cost producers in the world, but there's a belief that from the outside, because I'm living in Europe again, that there is not a transparent desire to embrace the transition. And I think we should address that here, because I lived on the ground and I could see it, but that's the perception. And I don't know how you overcome the perception. I think one way is to sit in a round table in front of an international audience to stress that need. But the reality is, Amrita, is that they'll be the last man or last woman standing as producers because of the low cost advantage, correct? So they should do it as cleanly as possible.
And I think that's what they've taken upon themselves, and they're doing it extremely successfully, right? Like you heard from both their excellencies about what each of the respective countries is doing. But to your point, and this is where social media comes in, as an industry, I genuinely do believe we haven't done a good enough job in educating people. You know, in some ways, this is an echo chamber. We would agree with each other. We need to do better in telling the world, like, this is, nobody's actually protecting themselves. This is a much more realistic transition. Why do we get hung up about colors? Why green and not blue, right? Like, that's where I personally feel Europe has lost the argument, the obsession, and America as well to a certain extent, the obsession with it has to be a certain type that immediately doesn't allow the possibilities that there are different challenges in different parts of the world.
Yeah, I think you addressed that, Sharif, at the beginning. I want to definitely get into this idea, why is it acceptable? You said more than 1 billion people don't have access on a daily basis, but 700 million don't have access to energy at all, which is extraordinary, and I think that COP did address it. Marco, you wanted to talk about the trilemma, which is a very important report for the World Energy Council, but the quadrilemma, how do you define that for this panel?
Yeah, you're exactly right. So we always talk about security, affordability, sustainability, but and then we say, you know, we need to act fast. So that's the quadrilemma. It's speed. You know, we cannot wait until 2050 for something to happen and materialize. And moving to the region, now I live in Riyadh after spending my career in Europe and the US mostly, more than a year ago. I really like that everything that is being done in Saudi Arabia, in the Emirates, and I would put also Uzbekistan as the second largest country in our portfolio, which was unexpected for me, with clear goals by 2030 and actions that are really, really huge. You know, if we think about the program in Saudi Arabia, of course, is the one I'm most familiar with. The plan is to build 20 gigawatt of renewable energy every year. That's more or less combining Germany, France, the UK, probably more than that, which is a market that is 4 times as big, all combined. So the speed is phenomenal. ACWA Power is a leader in this transition. And, you know, I might be tempted to talk more about ACWA Power. I mean, I'll just give you an example. We are 55 gigawatt of installed capacity today. Used to be zero renewable maybe 5-6 years ago. Today, 46%. But I don't want to talk about ACWA Power because we cannot work and deliver at a speed that is higher than what the host government allows you to run it. And that's why I really always say that ACWA Power is a poster child of Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia. That is a phenomenal change, social, cultural, economical, sustainable. It's a poster child of the opportunities in the Emirates and more recently of what we saw in Uzbekistan. And that, as I arrived in the country and leading this company, great organization, I say we're the best in the world. But at the end, what does it take to make it happen? Since, as I said, at the end, you can always go only as fast as the host country. And what I see is a combination of 3 things. So the first one is leadership. Somebody who comes with a clear vision and clear targets, measurable in the short term. The second is a strong, close dialogue with private investors, because you cannot deliver a vision unless the private investor comes and delivers it for you. And the third is quick decisions. So once you bring these 2 together, then yes, you can do tenders, you can do, you know, a slow process, but if you can then jump and say, I will do bilateral negotiation for a volume, I will do tenders for another volume, so I get price control, but I get speed and scale. And I allow also companies like ACWA Power to come in and look beyond the project and elevate the overall industry with local content, with education, with things that go beyond the energy part.
Okay, let me follow up quickly. I think this audience would be fascinated to know how many countries you're operating in, because ACWA Power is 10 years old, am I correct?
20 years old this year, and we now operate in 14 countries. I would say that Saudi Arabia for us is about 60% of our volumes. Of course, the Gulf region, we're the largest private desalination company in the world, so we serve the needs of about 20 to 30% of the population in Saudi, the Emirates, Oman, Bahrain, increasingly green. We can talk more about that, but we have one application that is 100% solar power for large-scale desalination. I think it's the first one in the world. Even the applications that we have in Tawila in the UAE or Jazla in Saudi Arabia are 30% fueled by solar power. And increasingly we go beyond. So if we focus just on desalination, we just signed the first contract outside of the region in Senegal a few weeks ago, and we look to expand in countries from Africa to Central Asia to China and Southeast Asia.
Sure, they make money, though. This is the other idea. There's this misnomer that you can't make money at these projects. These desalination plants and distribution of solar projects can still make money.
Yeah, so I think that you're touching an interesting point, because I think you're trying to find the kind of the equilibrium between the returns that a private investor needs to have and the affordability that the host country, particularly in some countries in the global south, needs to achieve. And that is where we are trying to bring together multiple things. Ingenuity in scouting for the best technologies and the new designs, to bring together to lower the cost, to lower the emissions, but then the financing and the structural side. At the end, when we do project financing, 70 to 80% is debt. So we need to look at how to provide the cheapest debt, working with ECAs, working with DFIs, development finance institutions, so that you de-risk the project and you attract debt and potentially also additional equity. We typically retain about 30-40% of the equity. The other we give to strategic partners or financial partners. So for every dollar that we invest, we mobilize more than 10. And that's what we're trying to do, so that everything can accelerate and reach the speed that I was talking about.
Okay, well, I'd like to bring Dr. Walid back into the conversation, because at COP28, you said there's a lot of commitments on how to unlock financing. There's particular attention, to Sarah's point, you know, the region sits at the crossroads of East and West and North and South. So there's perspective to have appreciation what Africa is struggling through. From the COP28 commitments that His Excellency was talking about, how can you leverage that, Dr. Walid, to make it work in Lebanon? Can you get debt financing, as Marco's saying? Can we think differently about a regional development bank or the World Bank to say this is a priority, we need energy? How do we allow Lebanon to attract some of that capital?
Absolutely. I mean, COP28 did a great job in setting out ambitious but achievable targets, and I'm talking as far as our region, but also as Lebanon is concerned. In Lebanon, we did actually not only pledge but accomplish the target of doubling down on energy efficiency and tripling renewable energy, and it was a matter of economics. And as I explained earlier, the differential in the cost allowed to increase a lot the renewable energy and to reduce the energy consumption, which is energy efficiency in its, at its best. The barrier to going to the next level in progress in the new technologies and in the flourishing of sustainable energies in Lebanon, but I think also in the region, but in Lebanon we feel it more severely, is the financing. As I said earlier, all the financing, and we have now about 1,500 or 1,500 megawatts of solar installed, if not even more, but all that is equity financing. Can you imagine what can be done if we had access to debt financing? There are in the room, I think, small funds that have started deploying debt-based financing, especially for industrial applications. This is where the cash flow is more readily visible to the investor, because you need cash flow on the other side in order to be encouraged to invest in financing, and I can only applaud them. I think they are leveraging funding from USAID, from large corporations like SAM, ACWA, and others who are happily co-funding, but this remains very limited, like a few $1 million kind of projects, and what we need is talking about projects that are worth hundreds of millions of dollars and not only a few million, even at the scale of Lebanon. There's nothing today that prevents Lebanon from having 100 or 200 megawatt power plants. Because we have the legislation for it, we have the economic basis for the investment, all we need, and we have equity, interested equity investors. But they need access to financing. And so far, I want to say, and it's unfortunate, I want to say that we kind of are experiencing a sort of a blockade that's not allowing debt financing. And I'm talking about renewable energy projects. Other people are suffering from the lack of funding in refineries and downstream, etc., which are also more, I want to say equally important, I even say sometimes more important, but as part of the transition. But for our case, it's just not there. Not even for renewable energy.
Is that because of ESG with the governance, that they don't trust with the controversies of the central bank and the rotating finance ministry?
We can talk a lot about this, but I think some of it is political in nature, and that's something where we can speculate. It has to do with the positioning of the country, the region, etc. And some of it has to do with Lebanon fundamentals. The economic crisis that hit the country, a financial system that is broken, and over 4 years, nobody has done anything about it. And that's a problem. We have a broken financial system. We don't have access to local debt financing from the local banks because they are zombie banks and not doing their job. And we don't have a governance mechanism today that is reforming this system. I can talk and I can even be proud of what the ecosystem in the energy space, and I think a small contribution from our side, has helped the energy sector achieve from a structural perspective and in the results. We cannot say the same about the financial system.
Very good. I appreciate it. No, I appreciate the candor as well. One of the things I'd like to follow up with you, Your Excellency, is the targets to triple renewables and double efficiency. We talk about tripling nuclear capacity. It wasn't in the final agreement, but 22 countries basically at COP signed on. I was chairing that nuclear gathering, which is really powerful. The driving that the UAE did from the ENIC standpoint to support this development. I know that the ministry was very involved. Is there a risk that we're setting stretch targets? Can they be achieved? Is it obtainable? And if they don't, do people get deflated and say, okay, this COP process just doesn't deliver for us? How do you see that?
Well, first of all, John, regarding the financing part, if you notice, there was a financing charter that was signed during COP28, and unfortunately only 13 countries out of the 200 or so countries signed up for it. Saying that there was some good news as well. Around $85 billion were committed in terms of the energy transition. There were multilateral banks that also committed another 180 billion. And then there was an initiative that was launched by UAE, which is Altera. And they are targeting around 250 billion in terms of investments. It's a catalyst basically injecting cash into high impact emerging markets. So it wasn't all bad news. Now, when you look at the targets that we have come up from COP28, there are challenges. And from my perspective, I see three main challenges. First challenge is on the scope. If you look at what we're targeting to get to is around 11,000 gigawatts by the year 2030. What that means is the capacity that we have today, we built over the last 12 years, we have to double that capacity in half the time. And that goes back to what Marco was saying, is looking at the quadrant, we need to move fast. Yeah. If you look at, of course, renewable energy has its own challenges. Intermittency, the requirement of storage, the reliability and availability of the grids itself, and then also land requirements. We did a very quick calculation in terms of how much these extra renewable energy would require us land, and we saw it's around 10 times the size of Singapore. So this is also a problem for countries that have limited land space. When you look at energy efficiency, and I think that is one of the most underestimated aspects. I've been here now for around 24 hours, and some of the talks I attended yesterday, everybody's talking about hydrogen, renewable energy. Nobody's touching upon energy efficiency.
Just if you could squeeze out 10 to 15% on demand. right, through the industrial sector. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, what I always say is the best form of emissions reduction is energy you don't consume. That's the easiest one. And we've done quite a lot in the UAE. We actually formed a national committee. It includes the private sector, it includes the local governments, and it includes the federal government. In 2.5 years, we've been able to reduce 13% of our energy consumption. We're focusing 3 major sectors. It's the building sector, the transportation, and the industries. And I think this is the low-hanging fruit. Really, we need to focus.
And that focus, I would add one, not so much for the UAE, of course, but we had this conversation in the opening panel. Is that there's some areas that the media, in particular, I've spent 30 years in it. They just don't focus on energy in the equation to agriculture, right?
True.
And the building sector, as you said, these are things that we could focus on that could have a profound difference. Go ahead, Amrita.
Just adding to what Your Excellency was saying, the efficiency bit, John, you talked about the media. All you hear about electric cars, Tesla, which company is going to go after the next EV and so on. But the dent, say for instance, that makes to oil demand in the long term versus pure energy efficiency gains. That's the thing that moves the needle. And same for gas in the building sector. Like you could triple the efficiency even in countries like Europe and North America, forget the global south. And that's somehow the bit that nobody is focusing on.
Good. Why not?
It's not sexy.
Yeah. I thought the architects love their sexy buildings. This is interesting. And Marco and Sarah, please jump in if you'd like.
Yeah.
So good. Just go ahead, Sri.
We've done some things that, again, it's good to share over here. Is as a federal government, we've started to think outside the box. What we've done is we've also formed some SPVs with the private sector. So if you look at how do we expand and how do we electrify transportation, and we've seen that there is a need for a comprehensive infrastructure to charge EVs. We formed an SPV as a joint venture between the ministry and the private sector, and we're expanding across the 7 Emirates. Similarly, also, if you go to the buildings, I'm talking about schools, hospitals, mosques, we have formed SPVs with the private sector, like the Honeywells, the Schneiders, the Siemens. We're putting zero capital, and we are retrofitting and rehabilitating all of these buildings, saving anywhere in the range of around 30%.
30%. Wow, that's interesting. Sarah, do you want to add to it? I want to get Marco to talk about.
So on energy efficiency, yes, we have a similar example in Kuwait where we took something like 90 schools and we put some solar units on the top and some monitors and central control on electricity, and it was amazing. We reduced consumption by 40%. 40% to the. So yes, energy efficiency is the way to go to reduce consumption, and I completely agree with focusing attention.
I just want to bring Marco back into the idea, and I think it ties into what His Excellency Sharif was talking about. Is the leadership here, because a lot of, again, I just want to be sober, because I understand the region very well. When we define leadership today, how does it look like outside your country? You talked about Uzbekistan, which I'm going to at the end of May. And the role of Masdar, for example, I think is really interesting. It's an incubator, right? It's deploying capital. Once you start, Marco, and then Sharif, if you want to jump in, it'd be great.
Yeah. So I also wanted to jump in on the discussion, not on efficiencies, but adjacencies, but and I will bring it into that. So there's a project in Saudi Arabia called Red Sea Global. That is, I think, something phenomenal in terms of everything we're talking about, because it brings together 3 different things. So the first one is a very large-scale resort that's going to have 85 high-level resorts, so thousands of people working there and visiting, and it's 100% renewable. So we're building all the utilities there, so from the power generation, desalination, wastewater, everything is powered by solar power, with battery storage to be reliable and all that. It brings together also a second initiative of Saudi Arabia, that is the oil sustainability program. So the idea is, rather than burning oil, what can I do to participate in the energy transition? And one of the uses there is to create these membranes that we use on the ground to basically flush the wastewater that we get from these resorts and camps where the staff are living, where it leaves all the nutrients, and we're growing mangrove wetlands. And then the residual water goes to a nursery where 30 million plants, 30 million trees will be used for the landscaping of all these resorts. That's the third initiative, which is the Saudi Green Initiatives of planting 600 million trees by 2030 to greenify the desert, basically. So that's how, it goes beyond the single, and I really appreciate, we were talking with His Excellency Sharif about the scope of his ministry. When you bring together housing and transportation and energy, everything overlaps today. So the ability to have a single discussion and looking at the ramification, in Saudi it's called Vision 2030. So how you bring all these initiatives together and how you build on each other. So that's the little point that I wanted to bring to the discussion about not just the efficiencies, but the broader scope. In the other countries, I think that I mentioned, the big success in Uzbekistan, and I think that there we are about 60%, I would say, of the new energy that will be installed under a big program that will save up to 60% of the current gas consumptions, basically by transforming everything into renewables and battery storage, of course, so that you can free up this gas for uses that are more elevated, let me say. So I think that in a lot of these countries, really, the growth, the need for energy to really increase the standard of living. I mean, we talk about decarbonization because a lot of the debate is driven by the global north, affluent, where we are replacing a generation with something different. In other countries, really, it's about the pace, not just about decarbonization, but building new capacities so that you can elevate the standard of living of people, which will solve other crises, migration, and all that. So I think that is where we're looking for a dialogue. And sometimes here, yes, the government-to-government support. We see Masdar with the UAE, we see ourselves with Saudi Arabia, which today, honestly, coming from a different region and here, and that's something that Amrita was saying, we need to talk more in the West about what's going on there. Positive beyond energy, because the fact that we have these countries that today are becoming kind of the only ones in a fragmenting and polarizing world that talk to everybody and maintain the relationship with everybody, I think that they can be great catalysts for better living conditions around the globe.
Okay, I'm going to ask Amrita to take a topic that we didn't talk about at all, and I want to open the floor to questions very quickly. You're based in London now, right? But you travel the world. Yeah, sort of. At my address. Yeah. There's an inherent bias against the Gulf states. And I just think we should put it out there because we're in Europe. And no matter what you do, right, even the COP28, I got to say to Dr. Sultan, the guy took machine gun fire for like 9 months. And, he came out the other side, but there was a question like, how much can somebody take? How do we reverse the preconceived notions of the Middle East, which would include Dr. Walid, and people just saying, oh, they're just throwing oil money around and they're not delivering on this diversity that you're talking about, or what Marco said or what Sarah said. I say this when I'm in a conversation in the UK or in Germany or the United States, like, oh, that's just the Gulf Arabs are just doing it, throwing cash around, and they don't believe what's on the table, which I find it offensive, to be candid.
I was literally going to say this. Funny you asked me the question. I was going to say to you, you and Marco and I, we are the three non-natives, right, from the region. Genuinely, the only way you can solve this is, and even though I live in London, I'm not from the region, I would say, go and visit the region. That is the only way you will get convinced of every effort. And I mean, again, I have roots there because of my parents and my father. So I've been going to the Middle East from 1991 when I was a kid. I have seen the transformation and I've seen what it is now and everything Marco talked about, right, in terms of the wider, not just kind of energy. And I'll even put it out there, there's a lot of talk about, when you mentioned ESG, right, it's not just the E bit of it, the S and G. There are more women working in energy in the Middle East than in North America.
For sure.
When I present and when I go to the Midwest, presenting at board meetings, maybe the only woman I see as a secretary of the CEO. Versus when I go to the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Prince Abdulaziz in particular, real champion of women in the industry. I mean, Sarah, you've been in this industry for long enough, Kuwait, UAE, every single. So it's a much more holistic picture, and there is no way. I think you're exactly right. Us talking, you have to go there to see it. And the UK's energy secretary was actually in Saudi Arabia at a similar time as I was. This was in February. When I speak to Claire, she talks about it now. She's like, she's so mesmerized by what the country has changed and how it's changed and evolved. She's like, if I hadn't gone there, I would have not believed it.
Yeah.
And I think that's the key.
Yeah, I always say to the leadership, the seeing is believing. You wanted to jump in on this?
Yeah, last week, World Future Energy Summit, there was a hydrogen summit that was kicked off by ex-Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And he made a very clear statement. He was comparing the COP in Glasgow versus the COP in the UAE. And he publicly said that what I've seen over here, the amount of progress that has been made from an environmental perspective is immense. You're right, John. There is, I would say, maybe a misperception in terms of the Middle East and especially the oil-producing countries. I have to be very clear, John. All of us over here in the WIC, we are gathered over here to address a problem and find a solution to it. I want to be very clear. The problem is emissions. It is CO2 emissions. The problem is not eliminating a reliable, viable source of energy. This is the issue, and people are really diverting from the real issue. We need to find solutions. We don't need to eliminate a source of energy that is building economies, that is feeding all the globe. I am a firm believer that gas is not going to go anywhere. Yeah. For the next few decades, gas is going to be a transitional fuel, and it will be needed. The energy mix in the year 2030, 2040, 2050, 60, whatever target countries have put, will be a mix. There will be probably a lot of renewable. There will be some nuclear. There will be gas. There will be fossil fuels. This is no doubt. And there will be hydrogen. It will be a mix. That's no doubt about it.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because Dr. Wilkinson was saying in the opening session yesterday, it's 1,000 points of just making sure that we connect them better.
Exactly.
And I think you would, in that natural gas narrative that you were talking about, just do it as clean as possible, right?
And find the solutions. Build on technology, build on R&D.
Yes.
If some of you just want to visit the ADNOC stand, see what they're doing in terms of carbon capture. Injecting CO2 into rock formations that consume the CO2. Very interesting. It's already over there, so the ones who will get a chance, please, my advice to you is do visit them.
Go ahead.
And John, this is a wonderful discussion. But I don't want us to forget that, like 2 weeks ago, we were on the verge of a nuclear war in the region, which would have deprived the whole world of the energy source. And this is something we cannot close our eyes to because, first we had Kuwait invasion, and then we had Iraq, and then now we have Israel and Hamas. So the geopolitical environment in the region is always volatile. And this volatility does not only impact the region, it impacts everybody in the world. And that's why it is very important that we collectively, people in the West have to see the point of view of the people from the region. We cannot be sitting there. And the West is supporting Israel today, you are creating your own enemy, believe me. Because, you have given them carte blanche and to hit anyone they like at any time with funding millions from those. This money that goes into buying weapons could go into cleaning the world, can go to renewable, it can go to better usage of these funds to create a better world instead of this huge destruction that will have huge impact on the whole world if it is
non-continuous. I have to say, having covered the region, and I respect what you're saying, is the last 30 years, Saudi didn't have a seat at the table in negotiations. The UAE didn't have a seat at the table in negotiations. And even if they're not publicly at the table, the dialogue now, even with Iran, with Oman, which has been a state actor in that process, Kuwait even, I think is impressive actually, because they want to take more control of their future destiny. That's a different debate about giving Israel carte blanche and the weaponry behind it. But this is an energy session. But I respect what you're saying, because the region has to be secure. But I think they're controlling more of their destiny than they ever have before, right? You do. Rich, and I think we'll have to close it, but I was going to take questions from before. I would say it's a damn good debate, though. Go ahead.
Just kind of adding to what His Excellency Sharif was saying, we have 15% of the world's population consuming 40% of the world's energy, which is Europe and North America. So it's very easy for us to stand, on a high horse and say, you need to reduce your energy consumption, and you need to do so and so. Yet, nobody in the West, partly in democracies, everybody wants to get re-elected. Nobody's willing to stand up, and that's why I think Marco's point of leadership is so important. And you come from the region, to say the truth about energy transition is going to be expensive. And that's why it goes back to the very first question you asked. That's where the NOCs are leading from the front. They are putting the money where effectively they are talking about, which is an energy transition. All the other governments want somebody else, sorry, not all, I mean all Western governments want somebody else to do it for them. Nobody will tell you, oh, by the way, this is the true cost of energy transition, this is the true cost of carbon border tax. When I talk to airline CEOs, they'll say to me, to date, not a single ticket has been sold, which is sustainable aviation fuel, SAF, or by choice. Like when you're buying the ticket, nobody's actually ticked the SAF box. If you're forced to, that's different. That's at the crux of the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, same thing with the heat pumps. We're redoing a house in London, and the cost of the heat pumps are too expensive for people to take them on, so they're missing their targets. I apologize for not taking questions from the floor, but I have to say, what a fantastically good discussion. You almost got me into a very deep political debate there, Sarah. I had to steer clear. I have my own opinions, but I should be careful with that.
What's
that? What did you say?
On the spaceship.
Yeah, what about the spaceship? I'm still waiting for that ship that carries the cargo containers around the world. Maybe you've got a vision I haven't seen yet.
Well, you have to watch the Star Trek.
Yeah, exactly. Watch Star Trek. Can we give a nice round of applause for the panel?
And this was the